Right in front of the bishop, her betrothed suddenly dropped her hands. The chill of his next words proved far colder than the icy draft sweeping through the grand cathedral. Turning toward the crowded pews, he let his voice echo off the ancient stone. "I cannot wed her," he announced, his gaze bypassing his bride to lock dead onto the front row, specifically, onto her younger sister. The marriage between the Silverfall pack and the Crescent Valley pack had been arranged for nearly a decade. For Genevieve, it was the sole purpose of her existence. As the eldest daughter of Lord Harrison, the Alpha of Silverfall, her life was not her own. She was a political pawn, molded, trained, and disciplined to become the perfect Luna for Roland, the young and ambitious Alpha of Crescent Valley. The cathedral was packed with the elite of 3 territories. Over 500 wolves sat in the pews, adorned in velvet, furs, and heavy gold chains. The scent of pine, burning wax, and nervous anticipation filled the cavernous hall. Genevieve wore a gown of heavy ivory silk, embroidered with silver thread that cut into her collarbones. The veil over her face was suffocating, but she stood tall, her posture flawless as she looked at Roland. He was handsome, with golden hair and a sharp jawline, exactly the kind of man a young woman was supposed to desire. Yet, throughout their courtship, he had barely looked at her. As Bishop Odell raised his hands to invoke the moon goddess's blessing on their union, Roland's fingers suddenly twitched. His grip on Genevieve's hands loosened. The faint scent of cedar and rain that usually surrounded him suddenly soured with raw, unfiltered panic. "Roland?" Genevieve whispered, her voice barely carrying over the crackling candles. He didn't look at her. He dropped her hands completely, taking a heavy step back. The collective intake of breath from the congregation sounded like a gale of wind rushing through the cathedral. "I cannot do this," Roland said, his voice trembling at first, before he squared his shoulders and let his alpha tone bleed into his words. "I cannot wed Genevieve." Lord Harrison stood up so fast his heavy oak chair crashed backward against the stone floor. "Roland, what is the meaning of this madness?" "The treaty." "The treaty will stand, Lord Harrison," Roland interrupted, though his eyes darted nervously away from the furious Alpha. "But not with her. The goddess has spoken to me today. I caught the scent the moment she walked down the aisle as a bridesmaid. The mate bond is undeniable. I have found my fated mate." Genevieve felt the blood drain from her face. A fated mate. It was the only law that superseded a political arrangement. But who? Roland turned, his eyes locking directly onto the front row, where the bridesmaids stood in pale blue velvet. He walked down the 3 altar steps, reaching out his hand. From the line of women, a delicate figure stepped forward. It was Rosalind, Genevieve's younger sister. Rosalind, with her cascading blonde curls and wide, innocent doe eyes. Rosalind, who had always received their mother's warmest smiles and their father's most leniency. She looked up at Roland, her hands trembling as she took his, but Genevieve, knowing her sister better than anyone, saw the triumphant, calculated smirk play at the corner of her lips. "My mate," Roland declared, pulling Rosalind against his chest. Chaos erupted. Lords and ladies shouted, the bishop dropped his holy texts, and Lord Harrison roared for silence. Genevieve stood entirely alone at the altar. The humiliation was a physical weight, crushing her lungs. She was a rejected bride. In werewolf society, a woman left at the altar was considered tainted, a defective vessel unable to hold her mate's attention. Even though Roland claimed it was the goddess's will, the stigma would fall entirely on Genevieve. Lord Harrison, calculating the political fallout in seconds, stormed forward. He looked from Roland to Rosalind, then finally to Genevieve. There was no pity in his eyes, only cold, hard pragmatism. "The Crescent Valley Alliance is too vital to lose," Lord Harrison boomed, addressing the murmuring crowd. "If the moon goddess has deemed Rosalind the true mate of Alpha Roland, we shall not stand in her way. The bloodline remains intact, the alliance stands." He turned to Genevieve, lowering his voice to a harsh hiss. "Step down, Genevieve. Take off the veil. You are making a scene." "I am making a scene?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "Father, he has shamed me before the entire territory." "You failed to secure his affections," her father snapped back. "Now, stand aside. Let your sister take her rightful place." Genevieve felt a tear slip down her cheek, burning like acid. She reached up with trembling hands and pulled the heavy veil from her face. The pitying stares of the crowd burned into her skin. Lady Beatrice, her mother, was already rushing forward to adjust Rosalind's hair, utterly ignoring her eldest daughter. Genevieve took a step down the altar, the heavy silk of her dress dragging on the floor like a shroud. She prepared to walk the long, agonizing aisle toward the back doors, a pariah in her own home. But before she could take another step, the massive, iron-reinforced oak doors of the cathedral blew open with a deafening crash. The wind howled into the cathedral, snuffing out half the candles and plunging the back of the hall into shadow. The silence that fell over the crowd this time was not born of shock, but of primal, suffocating terror. The scent hit them first. It was overpowering frost, crushed pine needles, and the distinct, metallic tang of fresh blood. It was an alpha aura so dense and oppressive that several weaker wolves in the back pews were instantly forced to their knees, gasping for breath. Stepping through the threshold was a nightmare made flesh. It was King Alaric of the Winterborn pack, the Alpha King of the North. He was a man built like a siege engine, towering over every other wolf in the room. He wore dark leathers scarred from battle, and a massive cloak of midnight black wolf fur draped over his broad shoulders. A colossal broadsword rested on his back. His face was rugged, intensely masculine, but marred by 3 jagged scars that slashed from his left temple down to his jaw, a reminder of the war he had waged to unify the brutal northern territories. King Alaric rarely left his mountain fortress. He had been invited to this wedding merely as a formality, a diplomatic courtesy no one expected him to honor. Yet, here he was. Lord Harrison went pale. Even Roland, standing smugly beside Rosalind, swallowed hard and unconsciously took a step back. Alaric's icy gray eyes swept the room. The oppressive weight of his gaze pinned every soul in place. Then, he inhaled sharply. His massive frame went entirely rigid. The terrifying, unyielding King of the North suddenly looked as though he had been struck by lightning. His eyes darted past the terrified guests, past the cowering Lord Harrison, past Roland and Rosalind. His gaze locked onto Genevieve. Genevieve froze. Her heart hammered wildly against her ribs. The air between them crackled with an invisible electric tension. Suddenly, her own senses flared to life. Beneath the terrifying scent of blood and frost, she caught something else, rich amber, burning firewood and deep earth. It wrapped around her, warming the icy chill in her blood. "Mate," her wolf whimpered, pacing wildly in her mind. "Mate, King." Alaric began to walk down the aisle. Each heavy footfall of his boots echoed like a war drum. The crowd parted violently, people scrambling over pews to get out of his path. He didn't spare them a single glance. His entire focus was consumed by the woman in the discarded, ivory dress, standing alone on the altar steps. He reached the front. Lord Harrison, trying to salvage his pride, stepped into his path. "King Alaric, we are honored by your unexpected presence, but we are in the middle of—" "Silence," Alaric growled. The word was not a request. It was a command laced with alpha power that made Lord Harrison's knees buckle. Alaric stepped past him and approached Genevieve. Up close, he was even more intimidating. He dwarfed her entirely. Yet, as he looked down at her, the terrifying storm in his icy eyes softened into something impossibly deep and possessive. He reached out slowly, taking off his heavy leather gauntlet, and gently cupped her cheek with his bare hand. His palm was calloused and warm. Sparks of electricity shot through Genevieve's skin at his touch, making her gasp. "Mine," Alaric rumbled, his voice a deep, gravelly vibration that shook the very stones of the cathedral. "You are mine." The cathedral erupted into pandemonium once more. "This is an outrage," Roland yelled, finding false bravery. "She is the rejected bride. She is tainted. She—" Before Roland could finish the sentence, Alaric moved. It was a blur of violence. In a fraction of a second, Alaric crossed the distance, grabbed Roland by the throat, and slammed him into the stone altar. The crack of stone echoed loudly. Roland choked, his face turning purple as the Alpha King hoisted him a foot off the ground with one hand. "Speak of my queen like that again, boy," Alaric whispered, his voice deadly quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. "And I will tear your throat out and feed it to my hounds." Rosalind screamed, shrinking back against the pews, her hands covering her mouth. Alaric tossed Roland aside like a broken doll. The Crescent Alpha crumpled to the floor, gasping for air, clutching his bruised neck. Alaric turned back to Genevieve, ignoring the terrified whimpers of the nobility. He stripped off his massive black fur cloak and draped it over Genevieve's trembling shoulders, covering the delicate silk of her wedding dress. The heavy weight of his scent instantly grounded her, shielding her from the chaotic smells of panic in the room. "We are leaving," Alaric said, offering his hand to her. Lord Harrison scrambled forward, his face a mask of panic and greed. "Wait, King Alaric. If the goddess has made her your mate, then we must discuss terms, a dowry, an alliance between Silverfall and Winterborn." Alaric paused, looking over his shoulder at Lord Harrison with utter disgust. "You allowed this whelp," he pointed a boot at Roland, "to humiliate my mate in front of your entire pack. You stripped her of her dignity to secure your own power. I owe you nothing, Lord Harrison. There will be no alliance. If you ever step foot in the north, I will mount your head on my gates." He looked back at Genevieve. "Will you come with me?" Genevieve looked at her father, who was red-faced with fury. She looked at her mother, who was busy tending to a hyperventilating Rosalind. She looked at Roland, coughing on the floor. For 20 years, she had done everything they asked. She had bled for them, starved for them, perfected herself for them, and they had discarded her like trash in 5 minutes. She looked up at the scarred, terrifying king, who had claimed her without a second thought. "Yes," Genevieve said, placing her small, trembling hand into his massive one. "Take me away from here." They left the cathedral without looking back. Outside, the world was a canvas of white. A harsh winter storm had begun to roll over the mountains, blanketing the courtyard in deep, pristine snow. A massive, armor-plated carriage drawn by 6 heavily muscled draft horses waited at the gates, surrounded by 20 of Alaric's elite royal guards. They were silent, lethal men, wrapped in furs and chainmail. When they saw Alaric emerge with Genevieve holding his hand, they slammed their spears against their shields in a synchronized, deafening salute to their new queen. Genevieve jumped at the noise, but Alaric pulled her closer to his side. "Do not fear them, little bird," he murmured. "They are your shield now." He lifted her effortlessly into the carriage, climbing in after her. The interior was lined with thick pelts and warmed by a small iron stove in the corner. As the carriage lurched forward, beginning the long journey toward the northern border, Genevieve finally let out a shaky breath, the reality of the last hour crashing down on her. She was no longer Genevieve of Silverfall. She was the mate of the Winter King. For the first few hours, they sat in silence. Alaric watched her from across the carriage, his intense gaze never wavering. It wasn't predatory, but it was calculating, assessing. "You are cold," he stated suddenly. "I am fine, my king," Genevieve replied automatically, her posture rigid. Years of etiquette training made it impossible for her to show weakness. Alaric frowned, a deep crease forming between his brows. "You do not need to lie to me, and you do not need to call me my king. My name is Alaric." Before she could protest, he moved across the carriage, sitting beside her on the bench. He pulled her against his side, wrapping his large arms around her. The heat radiating off his body was incredible. Genevieve stiffened for a moment, terrified of doing the wrong thing, but the absolute safety of his embrace slowly chipped away at her defenses. She melted against his chest, closing her eyes. "They treated you poorly," Alaric said, his voice rumbling beneath her ear. "Even before today. I can see it in the way you hold yourself, like a soldier bracing for a blow." "I was raised to be a Luna," Genevieve whispered. "Perfection was not requested, it was demanded." "Perfection is an illusion," Alaric scoffed softly. He took her hand, tracing the faint scars on his own knuckles. "A pack does not need a perfect porcelain doll. It needs a queen with a spine of steel. I suspect you have one, Genevieve, hidden beneath all that silk and manners." The journey took them deep into the mountain passes, away from the manicured lands of Silverfall and into the untamed wilderness of the borderlands. The storm worsened by nightfall, slowing the heavy carriage. It was near midnight when the carriage abruptly jerked to a halt. The violent neighing of the draft horses pierced the whistling wind, followed immediately by the harsh metallic ring of swords being drawn outside. Genevieve shot up, panic flooding her veins. Alaric's demeanor shifted instantly. The gentleman holding her vanished, replaced by the lethal predator who had cowed a room of 500 nobles. His eyes flashed a brilliant, glowing gold in the dim light of the carriage stove. "Stay here. Get beneath the pelts," Alaric commanded, drawing the massive broadsword from his back in one fluid motion. "What is happening?" she asked, her voice trembling. "An ambush," he growled, pushing the carriage door open. The howling wind whipped snow into the cabin. Genevieve couldn't hide. She crept to the window, peering through the frosted glass. Outside, in the moonlight, absolute carnage was unfolding. Over 30 rogue wolves, men in dark, unmarked leather armor, had surrounded the carriage. They were fighting Alaric's elite guards, the clash of steel ringing through the frozen canyon. But as Genevieve looked closer, she noticed the fighting style of the attackers. They weren't uncoordinated rogues. They fought in strict, disciplined formations, crescent formations. Roland. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. Roland hadn't just humiliated her, he was trying to kill her. If Genevieve died before the mating bond with Alaric was consummated, the bond would sever. Lord Harrison could then attempt to pivot the alliance, offering Rosalind's firstborn to the north, or Roland could eliminate the threat of a humiliated, vengeful Winter Queen descending upon his territory in the future. She watched in horror as 3 assassins broke through the defensive line, rushing toward the carriage door. But Alaric was waiting for them. He didn't shift into his wolf form, he didn't need to. He moved with a terrifying, brutal grace that defied his massive size. With a single swing of his broadsword, he cleaved the first assassin in half, armor and all. The second assassin thrust a spear at Alaric's chest, but the Alpha King caught the wooden shaft with his bare hand, snapping it like a twig, before driving the hilt of his sword into the man's skull. The third assassin, realizing he was severely outmatched, tried to retreat. Alaric grabbed him by the throat just as he had done to Roland and slammed him against the side of the carriage. "Who sent you?" Alaric roared, his alpha tone shaking the snow from the surrounding pines. The assassin spit blood into the snow, refusing to answer. Alaric's claws extended, digging into the man's neck. Genevieve threw open the carriage door, the icy wind tearing at her dress. "Alaric, wait!" she shouted. Alaric looked at her, his golden eyes wild with bloodlust. But the sound of her voice made him freeze. "Look at his left wrist," Genevieve said, climbing down the carriage steps, her bare feet sinking into the freezing snow. Alaric ripped the leather gauntlet off the assassin's arm. Branded into the flesh of the man's inner wrist was a crescent moon overlapping a silver wolf, the crest of the Crescent Valley Pack. Alaric's eyes darkened to a terrifying pitch black. He dropped the dead assassin into the snow and turned to the remaining attackers who were being rounded up by his guards. "Roland sent them," Genevieve whispered, shivering as the cold bit into her skin. "He wants me dead to sever the bond. He fears your retaliation." Alaric stepped toward her, ignoring the blood on his armor, and scooped her up into his arms, sheltering her from the biting wind. He pressed his forehead against hers, his breathing heavy, his chest rumbling with an unholy fury. "He feared my retaliation before," Alaric whispered, his voice dark and deadly. "But now he will learn what it truly means to incur the wrath of the Winter King. I will burn Crescent Valley to the ground, and I will make your father watch." The remainder of the journey north was a grueling endurance test against the elements, a blur of howling blizzards and hushed, terrifying whispers in the dark. Genevieve spent the days wrapped securely in King Alaric's massive, heavy furs, her head resting against his broad chest, listening to the steady, reassuring rhythm of his heart. The assassination attempt in the snow had shifted something fundamental and irreversible within her. The quiet, obedient girl who had stood trembling at the altar in Silverfall had died in the snow alongside those Crescent Valley assassins. In her place, a quiet, dangerous ember of fury began to burn, stoked by the absolute, unwavering protection of the Winter King. On the dawn of the 5th day, the relentless northern storm finally broke, parting the heavy gray clouds to reveal the awe-inspiring, towering silhouette of Dunwall Keep. It was the ancient, impenetrable stone fortress of the Winterborn Pack. Built directly into the sheer side of a jagged black mountain, it overlooked a vast frozen valley that sparkled like crushed diamonds in the morning light. Unlike the decorative, sprawling, fragile estates of her father, Lord Harrison, Dunwall was a brutalist masterpiece of war and survival. Its walls were reinforced with dark iron, and massive direwolf banners snapped fiercely in the bitter wind. As the armored carriage rolled heavily through the colossal iron gates, the courtyard was already assembled to receive them. Hundreds of northern wolves stood in perfect, disciplined silence, snow dusting their broad shoulders. They were hardened, formidable people, clad in thick leathers, chainmail, and heavy wool, their faces scarred by the harsh elements and countless border skirmishes. They radiated a raw, untamed power that made the polished nobles of Silverfall look like soft, untested children. Alaric stepped out first, the cold wind whipping his dark cloak, and extended his bare, scarred hand to Genevieve. As she descended, the heavy black fur billowing around her shoulders over her ruined ivory silk dress, the entire courtyard dropped to a knee in perfect unison. The sudden deafening clatter of heavy armor against the cobblestone echoed through the crisp morning air like thunder. "Welcome home, my queen," rumbled a burly man stepping forward from the ranks. He had a thick, braided gray beard, a massive double-sided battle-axe strapped to his broad back, and eyes like chipped flint. "Genevieve, this is Commander Gregory Hastings, my second-in-command and master of war," Alaric introduced, his hand resting supportively and possessively on the small of her back. "And this," he gestured to a stern but warm-eyed woman holding a stack of folded woolen blankets, "is Lady Fiona Gallagher, our head healer and the den mother to our warriors." "It is a profound honor to meet you both," Genevieve said. Her voice, usually so soft and accommodating, surprised even her with its steady, ringing resonance. The northern wolves looked at her, their sharp eyes noting the dried bloodstains on the hem of her wedding dress and her bare, frost-nipped toes, but their gaze held no pity, only immense, profound respect. She had survived a targeted ambush by 30 trained killers and arrived standing tall. Over the next few weeks, Dunwall Keep became Genevieve's sanctuary and her ultimate crucible. Alaric did not lock her away in a lavish tower, nor did he demand she sit idly doing needlepoint or hosting frivolous teas, as her mother, Lady Beatrice, would have mercilessly insisted. Instead, he brought her directly into the fold of his leadership. He walked her through the armories, the training rings where warriors sparred with live steel, and the deep cellars where winter provisions were strictly rationed. He showed her the harsh reality of leading a pack that lived on the edge of survival. More importantly, he brought her into his inner circle, recognizing the razor-sharp mind that Lord Harrison had forcefully suppressed for 20 years. "You know the Southern Territories and their politics better than any of my finest scouts," Alaric told her one evening, as they stood together over a massive, carved wooden map table in his dimly lit war room. The firelight danced across the jagged, brutal scars on his face, making him look like a fierce predator. Yet his touch on her shoulder was astonishingly gentle, a stark contrast to his terrifying reputation. "Roland Pendleton is a coward, but a highly cunning one. What is his true objective? Why risk the wrath of the North just to sever a political marriage?" Genevieve stared intensely at the wooden markers representing the Crescent Valley and Silverfall armies. She traced the southern borders with her delicate finger, her mind working rapidly, connecting dots her father had been too arrogant and blind to see. "It was never about Rosalind," she whispered, the horrifying realization hitting her with sickening, crystal-clear clarity. "What do you mean, my queen?" Commander Gregory Hastings asked, leaning his massive bulk over the table, his brow furrowed in confusion. "The sacred treaty between our packs dictated that Roland would legally move his southern borders to accommodate Silverfall's hunting grounds upon our marriage," Genevieve explained, her eyes widening as the tactical picture fully formed. "But Roland has been rapidly and secretly expanding his military forces for 2 years. He doesn't want an equal alliance. He wants a full occupation. By rejecting me at the altar and falsely claiming Rosalind as his fated mate, he completely humiliated my father in front of all Southern nobility, forcing him into a politically weakened state to save face. My father would do absolutely anything to keep the alliance intact and project strength to the other lords." Alaric's icy gray eyes darkened to pitch black, his heavy jaw clenching. He fabricated a sacred fated mate bond, a blasphemy to the moon goddess. "Yes," Genevieve said, her voice turning to pure ice. "Rosalind has always been easily manipulated by flattery, shiny trinkets, and the illusion of power. Roland used her vanity. And by doing so, he gained unchecked, welcomed access to Silverfall's internal defenses under the guise of protecting his new mate's family. Just then, the heavy, iron-banded oak doors of the war room burst open with a deafening crash. A northern scout, breathless, bleeding from a fresh shoulder wound, and covered in thick frost, fell heavily to one knee on the stone floor. "My king! My queen! Urgent intelligence from the south," The Crescent Valley army has marched, but not towards our borders. Report the movement, Alaric barked, his voice echoing with raw, earth-shaking alpha command. Roland Pendleton has violently seized Silverfall. He claims Lord Harrison is unwell, treasonous, and unfit to rule. Crescent soldiers are currently occupying the Grand Cathedral and the main armory. Anyone who resists is being put to the sword immediately. Genevieve felt all the air violently leave her lungs. Her father's blind, desperate ambition had blinded him to the venomous viper he had eagerly invited into their home. Despite absolutely everything Lord Harrison had done to her, despite the crushing public humiliation he had forced upon her to secure his own legacy, it was still her pack. Silverfall was still her home, and its innocent people were suffering under a tyrant's boot. Alaric turned his massive frame to her, the golden rings of his irises glowing violently with lethal, unchecked intent in the dim firelight. But he did not issue a command. He did not tell his generals what they were going to do. He simply looked at his mate, deferring entirely to her judgment, and waited. Genevieve looked down at the tactical map, staring at the wooden pieces representing her home, then looked up at the towering, terrifying King of the North who had given her a voice. She stood up straighter, feeling the ancient, dormant, terrifying power of her own inner wolf finally break violently free from its heavy iron chains. "Gather the banners. Commander Hastings," Genevieve ordered, her voice ringing clear, cold, and echoing with the undeniable majestic authority of a true Luna. "We ride for Silverfall tonight." The Winterborn army did not march. They swept down from the mountains like an avalanche. 3,000 heavily armored wolves, clad in black iron and frost wolf pelts, descended upon the southern valleys with unnatural speed. At the head of the vanguard rode King Alaric on a massive black warhorse, and beside him, wearing custom-forged silver armor that gleamed like moonlight, rode Queen Genevieve. The siege of Silverfall was remarkably brief. Roland's soldiers, accustomed to bullying southern merchants and terrorizing unarmed villagers, broke rank the moment they saw the legendary Winter King breach the tree line. The northern wolves tore through the defensive perimeters with ruthless efficiency. Commander Hastings led a detachment that shattered the armory gates, while Lady Fiona Gallagher established triage tents to treat the wounded Silverfall citizens who had been trapped under Roland's martial law. Genevieve and Alaric did not stop at the gates. They rode straight for the Grand Cathedral, the very place where her life had been dismantled only 2 months prior. The massive iron-reinforced doors were barricaded from the inside. Alaric dismounted, drew his colossal broadsword, and with a single earth-shattering kick, splintered the ancient wood into kindling. The interior of the cathedral was chaotic. Pews were overturned, and the holy tapestries were torn. At the far end of the hall, near the bishop's altar, Roland Pendleton stood surrounded by a dozen of his elite royal guards. Behind him, chained to the very altar where he had once demanded obedience, was Lord Harrison. He was bloodied, bruised, and looked 10 years older. In the corner, sobbing hysterically and clutching a bruised cheek, was Rosalind. The illusion of her grand romance had shattered the moment Roland had secured the territory. "Alaric!" Roland yelled, his voice cracking with panic as the Alpha King and Genevieve strode into the echoing hall. "This is an internal southern dispute. You have no jurisdiction here." "The treaty. I wiped my boots with your treaty the day I claimed my mate," Alaric growled, his voice vibrating the remaining stained glass windows. Roland's guards lunged. It was a desperate, foolish maneuver. Alaric met them with the fury of a blizzard. His broadsword moved in devastating arcs, steel ringing against steel, blood spraying against the pale stone floors. He was a one-man vanguard, a god of war let loose in a holy house, dismantling the elite soldiers with terrifying ease. Genevieve did not wait for the fighting to end. She stepped around the clash of blades and walked straight toward the altar. Roland, seeing his men falling, drew a dagger and backed away, his eyes darting toward Rosalind. He grabbed the terrified girl by her hair, pulling her up and pressing the blade to her throat. "Stay back!" Roland screamed at Genevieve, his eyes wild. "Or your precious sister dies!" Genevieve stopped 10 paces away. She looked at Rosalind, whose wide, tear-filled eyes begged for salvation. Then, she looked at Roland. She didn't flinch. She didn't panic. "Do you know the history of the Silverfall Pack, Roland?" Genevieve asked, her tone conversational, completely detached from the hostage situation unfolding before her. Roland blinked, thrown off by her utter calm. "What?" We are called Silverfall because of a blessing from the moon goddess, Genevieve said, taking a slow step forward. Every few generations, a wolf is born with a coat of pure silver, possessing an alpha aura so dense it can break a lesser wolf's mind. My father suppressed my wolf because he was terrified I would usurp him. He forced me to be a docile bride. But Alaric taught me not to fear the cold. Genevieve's eyes suddenly flashed a brilliant, blinding silver. The aura that erupted from her was staggering. It wasn't the heavy, blood-soaked terror of Alaric's presence. It was a piercing, absolute pressure that felt like the freezing vacuum of a winter night. The temperature in the cathedral plummeted instantly. Frost began to spiderweb across the stone floor beneath her boots. Roland choked, dropping the dagger as his hands flew to his throat. The pressure in his skull was unbearable. He fell to his knees, gasping for air that felt like shattered glass in his lungs. Rosalind collapsed to the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. Alaric, having dispatched the last of the guards, stepped up behind his queen. He didn't intervene. He watched her with a look of absolute burning reverence. Genevieve walked up to the groveling Crescent Alpha. She looked down at him, her silver eyes glowing with divine judgment. "You are no Alpha," Genevieve said softly. "You are a parasite." She looked over her shoulder. "Alaric?" "Yes, my heart," he replied, leaning on his bloodied sword. "Remove his head." Alaric smiled a dark, terrifying expression. "With pleasure." The sound of Roland Pendleton's demise was quick, followed by a heavy, hollow thud. Silence descended upon the cathedral, broken only by the ragged breathing of Lord Harrison and Rosalind. Genevieve approached her father. The old lord looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of terror and awe. The daughter he had deemed worthless, the girl he had discarded to appease a tyrant, now stood before him as a sovereign, radiating a power he could never hope to possess. "Genevieve," Lord Harrison rasped, his lip trembling. You saved us. The goddess be praised. You have returned to take your rightful place by my side." "I have not returned for you, father," Genevieve interrupted, her voice entirely devoid of warmth. She gestured to the chains binding his wrists. "Roland stripped you of your title. You let him into our home. You allowed him to slaughter our people because you were too busy grasping for power to see the knife aimed at your back." She crouched down so she was eye level with him. "Silverfall belongs to the Winterborn Pack now. It is a northern territory. You and Lady Beatrice will be exiled to the eastern borders. If you ever set foot on my lands again, I will not be as merciful." Lord Harrison bowed his head, defeated, broken, and finally understanding the magnitude of his mistake. Genevieve stood and turned to Rosalind. Her younger sister scrambled backward, her beautiful dress torn and stained with soot. "Jenny, please," Rosalind wept, reaching out a trembling hand. "I didn't know. I thought he loved me. I was foolish. Please forgive me." Genevieve looked at the sister who had smirked at her humiliation, the sister who had eagerly stolen her life. There was no hatred left in Genevieve's heart, only a profound, hollow pity. "You have your life, Rosalind," Genevieve said quietly. "That is the only forgiveness I will offer you. Now go." As her family was escorted from the cathedral by the Winterborn guards, Genevieve stood alone at the altar. The irony was not lost on her. She was back exactly where she had started, but everything had changed. A heavy, warm cloak was draped over her shoulders. Alaric wrapped his arms around her waist from behind, pressing his chest against her back. The scent of frost, pine, and blood wrapped around her, making her inner wolf purr with deep, utter contentment. "You were magnificent," Alaric murmured into her hair, "a true queen of the north." Genevieve leaned back into his embrace, watching the frost she had summoned slowly melt from the stones. "We have a lot of work to do," she sighed. "Silverfall needs to be rebuilt. The people need to be fed." "We have time," Alaric said, kissing the side of her neck, sending a jolt of electricity down her spine. "The North remembers, Genevieve, and they will sing songs of the day the silver wolf claimed her throne." She smiled, placing her hand over his. She was no longer a pawn, no longer a discarded bride. She was Genevieve, of Winterborn, and she would never be cold again. Thank you so much for reading this epic werewolf romance. If you loved Genevieve's dramatic transformation and King Alaric's ruthless devotion, smash that like button to support the channel. Don't forget to share this story with your friends who love supernatural drama and fated mates. Subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss our next thrilling audio story. Tell us in the comments what you want to hear next. See you in the next video.